year's Refugee Week Research Series. My name is Maria Casaniti and I'm the manager of the Transcultural Mental Health Centre, which is a New South Wales Health statewide service. The centre's focus is to work with health and related professionals and a range of organisations to promote and enhance the mental health and wellbeing of culturally and linguistically diverse communities. I begin with acknowledging the Darug people as the traditional owners and ongoing custodians of the land in which this forum is taking place. I pay my respects to the Darug elders past and present and extend that respect to First Nations people that may be here with us today. As we are online, I also want to acknowledge the many other traditional countries and language groups that everyone is meeting from. The Transcultural Mental Health Centre celebrates and embraces diversity. So from the world's oldest continuous culture of our first Australians to the cultures of our newest arrivals from across the world, we acknowledge people with lived experiences as migrants or refugees and their families with us today, and the courageous journeys of many generations of Australians who have made Australia what it is today. Our centre acknowledges the individual and collective contributions of those with varied lived and living experiences and those who have loved and care for them. During Refugee Week, we acknowledge the strength and resilience of refugees, those seeking asylum and displaced people in their search for a life free from persecution and fear. We recognise the unique experience of their journey and we support their arrival and settlement and wholehearted participation in Australia. Finally, welcome to all our attendees today who come from mental health and related social services across New South Wales. Thank you to our speaker, Dr Philippa Specker, today. I also want to extend appreciation to those who have attended early in the week to hear about new research and from academic colleagues with considerable research experience in refugee mental health. Tomorrow is World Refugee Day 2025. Locally, with Finding Freedom, Diversity in Community as this year's Refugee Week theme, we are reminded of the essential role that community plays in the lives of people with refugee backgrounds. The theme challenges each of us to reflect on the true meaning of freedom and belonging, recognising that for many, the journey to reclaim dignity, identity and mental health is ongoing. New South Wales Health's New South Wales Refugee Health Plan 2022-2027 recognises that meeting the health needs of people from refugee backgrounds is critical to successful settlement and integration. As mental health professionals and researchers in this space, we understand the journey doesn't end at resettlement. The psychological impact of displacement, loss and trauma lingers long after arrival. But so too does resilience and so too does hope. For Refugee Week this year, the Transcultural Mental Health Centre has invited a range of researchers to contribute their expertise. We are honoured to have our final speaker in this research series with us today, Dr Philippa Specker, to discuss the important research that she is undertaking. The goal of this week-long research series has been to enhance the capacity of health professionals in providing effective care and support to refugees. Specifically, one, learning about current research that can help improve culturally responsive, person-centred approaches to support the mental health and wellbeing of individuals with refugee and asylum seeker experiences. And secondly, learning how best to empower individuals with refugee and asylum seeker experiences with strategies to connect with community, self-care and health literacy. Now, a reminder that we are recording this session as a learning resource and it will be available on our website along with the other sessions that we've held this week. And also be aware that we will be discussing some difficult issues, so please be mindful of how this might impact on you and others around you, and take care of yourself. Now, let's begin with an individual story celebrating Refugee Week. Today we have Tetiana Pishna speak of her journey with her daughter to Australia. The video that we're about to show is approximately 3 minutes long and is part of a series of Finding Freedom. Thank you. We're just waiting for the video to come on. Thank you. As we can see, the voice of the refugee is especially important in the current context, where refugee communities globally and locally continue to face discrimination and social exclusion and systemic barriers, all of which can significantly impact mental health and well-being. We recognise that individuals at the intersection of cultural diversity and different stages of their migration and refugee journey experience unique, layered, and moreover, intertwined challenges. These personal experiences matter, and as practitioners, it is our responsibility to listen, respond with cultural humility, provide inclusive, affirming care for the individual in front of us within the larger social context that they reside in. Now, at this point, let me introduce you to our facilitator, Emmeline. Emmeline works at the Transcultural Mental Health Centre and combines her clinical psychology background with her role as a mental health consultant in the mental health refugee program. Thank you, Emmeline.
Thanks, Maria, and happy Refugee Week, everyone, and welcome you all again to the final webinar of the research series. As introduced by Maria, I represent our statewide refugee mental health program. And for those who have yet to hear of our program, our initiatives includes both community and clinical capacity building, working hand in hand to support the mental well-being of recently arrived and emerging populations. This collaborative effort is what brings us together for today's Transforum. The video stories we've highlighted today and showcased throughout the week are segments of a longer feature shared on our website, produced by our community team with the support of Western Sydney Local Health District. The shared personal stories of Badri, Zara, Tetiana and Banan reminds us of the remarkable strength within each individual. Their experiences are about more than overcoming hardship. They're about healing, adaptation and hope for the future. So today we conclude our Refugee Week series with a presentation from Dr. Philippa Specker on the role of emotion regulation in refugee mental health. Briefly, Dr. Specker is a clinical psychologist and postdoctoral research fellow at the Refugee Trauma and Recovery Program in the School of Psychology at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. Thanks, Dr. Specker. When you're ready to share your slides.
Great, thank you so much for having me. Let me just get my slides up. Alrighty, hopefully that is clear for people.
All working well.
Thanks. Great. Emmeline, thank you so much for that introduction, and Maria as well. Thank you so much for the invitation to join Refugee Week in this Transforum series. It's a real treat. So I kind of wear two hats. I'm both a researcher, but I'm also a clinical psychologist. So for the next half hour, I kind of want to walk you through what we know and what we've learnt about the role of emotion regulation in refugee mental health. So to do that, firstly, let you know where we're going. I want to introduce you to the team that I work with so that you know a little bit about who we are, and then talk briefly on refugee mental health, what emotion regulation is, and then the current research that looks into the relationship between these two things. And finally, because this has a lot of clinical implications, I want to talk a little bit about what it might look like to support refugee clients with emotion regulation difficulties. And if I understand correctly, there is some Q&A time at the end as well. Okay, so I'm part of a research group called the Refugee Trauma and Recovery Program. So we're staffed by psychologists, neuroscientists, researchers, including student researchers and interpreters. And together we conduct research to better understand the psychological, social, environmental, and biological factors that might be influencing refugee well-being. And we're doing this research with a particular goal in mind, not to create research papers that go in journals that no one reads, but actually to use this knowledge and evidence to inform policies and practices so that we can better support the well-being of people from refugee backgrounds. So when we talk about mental health, it goes without saying, and I'm sure everyone in this forum is well aware, that sometimes the mental health needs of refugee communities can be quite significant and quite complex. And this has been really well illustrated by a piece of research a few years ago, which was a systematic review that looked at hundreds of studies across the world and was able to show that rates of mental illness were particularly high among refugee communities. So in the red box here, what we can see is among adult refugees, we see about 1 in 3 people reporting clinically significant levels of anxiety, about 1 in 3 people reporting clinically significant levels of depression, and again, close to a third having PTSD as well, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is quite different to the rates that we see among the general population in Australia and New Zealand, where it's 6% of people having anxiety or depression, and at the time of this study, as low as 1% of the population having PTSD. So we see much higher rates. And interestingly, we see this pattern also across child and adolescent mental health. And what I always find really interesting as well is that these rates of mental illness are much higher among refugee communities, even more so than what we see among populations that are still living in the country of origin where the conflict or war is occurring, which is that second column. And that probably is telling us that there's something about the refugee experience, in addition to trauma in your past home country, but perhaps also the experience of flight and displacement and the stress of resettling in a new country, that can all kind of contribute to creating greater complexity and severity when it comes to mental health burden. So it's really important to also consider what post-migration stress looks like for people from refugee backgrounds. And so post-migration stresses is just a term that refers to the living difficulties that are experienced by refugees in the resettlement environment. Things like visa insecurity, housing insecurity, being separated from family members, financial hardship, language difficulties, or finding it difficult to access healthcare and basic services. And what we've found is, over and above the impact of past traumatic experiences, these kinds of stresses also uniquely and strongly contribute to mental health difficulties. And there's been a lot of research on this, including in the Australian context with Australian refugee communities. And some of these findings are really striking. For example, on the left-hand side, this study, which was a really large cohort study, found that refugees in Australia who reported having to skip meals were twice as likely to have PTSD. And similarly, some of the work that I did with my colleagues in our research program, we found that refugees who had spent time in offshore detention before joining the Australian community were 20 times more likely to have PTSD compared to people who had spent a briefer period in onshore detention, but were processed relatively quickly before joining the community. So it really highlights that there's quite a lot of factors that might be contributing to the mental health burden in these communities. And so when we think about how best to respond to the mental health needs of refugees, despite me being a clinical psychologist, and obviously my main tool is is research and delivering therapies, it would be completely missing the big picture to not note that structural, political, and environmental change is critically important. If we improve people's environment, we get a lot of the way there in terms of improving their mental health. And another really striking example of this, which was some research from our group led by our director, Angela Nickerson, which showed that when refugees were able to transition from an insecure visa, like a bridging or temporary protection visa, and when they were actually granted a permanent protection visa, they went on to significantly show big improvements in mental health. This isn't therapy, this is a visa. And so I want to really acknowledge the wider context here in terms of, if we want to improve mental health, there's also a lot of environmental and policy and legislative change that we can focus on and advocate for to see some of those benefits. At the same time, we know that there's also substantial demand for effective and tailored psychological interventions to help refugees cope with distress too. So this is also a complementary pathway to improving mental health. And if we want to have effective treatments or interventions, the first step is making sure we have a good understanding of what might be the unique psychological factors that are driving mental illness among refugees. Because when we understand the causes better, we can treat the problem much more effectively. And so for the last kind of 2 decades or so, when a lot of large-scale research with refugee communities started to occur in Australia and internationally, this research really focused on the relationship between how past trauma and experiences of flight and transit and displacement, and also how post-migration stresses led to the development of mental illness for people from refugee backgrounds. And indeed, this is very much the case. All of these factors have been shown to really strongly influence the likelihood of developing mental illness or the severity of the mental illness you experience. So this is really important work. But also, a big part of the picture is missing here, because we also know that there's lots of people who experience, lots of refugees who experience these kinds of traumas, experience displacement, have the stress of resettling in a new country, but go on to show no or very few symptoms of mental illness. Recalling the statistics that I shared at the beginning of the talk, if about 1 in 3 people, refugees, are reporting PTSD, that means 2 in 3 aren't. So we also see enormous resilience among these communities, which tells us that maybe there might be some psychological factors that might influence the likelihood of whether, after having these traumatic and stressful experiences, someone then goes on to develop mental illness, or whether someone might be able to be a bit more protected against the development of mental illness. And so one of the most promising factors to consider here is emotion regulation, which is really what I'm going to focus on today. And so emotion regulation just refers to the capacity to monitor, evaluate, and modify your emotional responses to meet situational demands that come up in day-to-day life. And so often throughout this talk and throughout research, you'll also see the term emotion dysregulation, which just refers to a situation when someone has an impaired capacity to regulate their emotions. And this is a really promising factor to consider because a lot of research is now showing that a lot of aspects of the refugee experience, things like interpersonal trauma in particular, so trauma perpetrated by another person, but also the experience of displacement and post-migration stresses, all of these things have been shown to disrupt adaptive emotion regulation and cause emotion regulation difficulties. So it seems like this might be relevant to the picture here. So at the time that I was starting my PhD back in 2018, it felt like there were two fairly key outstanding questions to focus on. The first one is to really understand, okay, emotion regulation seems really relevant to refugee mental health, but is there a causal relationship here? Does emotion dysregulation cause mental illness among refugees? And we're interested in causes because that's where we get the most bang for our buck if we target a cause in therapy rather than just target a symptom. And then if that is the case, then which strategies might actually be the most helpful in promoting recovery? So to answer the first question, looking at a causal relationship, longitudinal research is really helpful to test this. So that's exactly what we did. We did this across two studies. The first one was called the Refugee Adjustment Study. This was a really large cohort, over 1,000 refugees from Arabic, Farsi, Tamil, and English-speaking backgrounds, resettled in Australia after 2011. And these participants completed online studies. They did it 5 times every 6 months for a period of about 2 years. And the majority of our participants came from Iraq originally, but it was quite a culturally diverse sample. And so among these online surveys included measures of mental illness, including things like measuring PTSD. We also measured emotion dysregulation using a really widely established scale that's been translated in lots of different languages. And we also were interested in measuring post-migration stresses because we need to make sure we're also considering the environment when we think about mental health, but also when we think about emotion regulation. Because if you're under a lot of stress, you're probably having a lot of negative emotions that requires a lot of regulation. I just want to make a quick note on measures or research when working with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, which is that we follow gold standard procedures for the translation and comprehension process, which means we do forward and blind back translations with accredited health interpreters from refugee communities. We reconcile any discrepancies and we pilot these measures with lots of people in the community at different levels of education and from different cultural backgrounds to make sure that people have a good understanding of the questions and that they're clearly written so that people know what they're answering. So with this information, we're able to conduct a particular kind of longitudinal analysis called random intercept cross-lagged panel model, which is a very fancy way of essentially saying that we can look at how one factor influences another factor over time whilst controlling for everything else. So it provides a really precise way to work out, does emotion regulation difficulties cause PTSD, or does PTSD cause emotion regulation difficulties to get worse? And so when we did this analysis, what we found was, in fact, that we found that emotion regulation difficulties, people who had more of these difficulties, went on to have their PTSD deteriorate and get worse over time. Now, people who had high PTSD, also we saw that that led to emotion regulation difficulties getting worse, but this relationship wasn't as strong as the other way around. And also, understandably, people who had more post-migration stresses, or as these stresses increased in their life, their PTSD subsequently got worse. So if we kind of take the key finding from this, it was really showing that greater emotion regulation difficulties was linked to subsequent increases in PTSD. So essentially, it's making PTSD worse. And this ended up being the first longitudinal evidence showing emotion dysregulation as a potential mechanism driving PTSD, which was really important and interesting. But of course, one study doesn't make a pattern. And so we wanted to also consider whether we saw this same relationship among refugees who are living in a very different environment, which are refugees who are stuck in transit in Indonesia, which is a really challenging place for a refugee to live, because Indonesia is not a signatory to the UN Convention, so there's no humanitarian obligations to provide any services or support for people who are living there awaiting their refugee status determination, which means that destitution, homelessness is really, really common. It's very, very high rates of mental illness among these communities. And so we wanted to understand what might be some of the factors that influence that. And this research is being used to inform a lot of advocacy and policy at the moment. But for the purposes of today's talk, again, we followed a large cohort of over 12,000 refugees from different backgrounds. And again, they completed these online surveys every 6 months over multiple time points. And again, we measured mental illness, but this time both PTSD and depression. And then we measured emotion dysregulation and also economic and social stresses. This population was a little bit different. The last one was about a 50-50 split between males and females, whereas here it's much more, they're much more predominantly males, male refugees that are living in Indonesia, and much more commonly from Afghanistan. Okay, so what did we find? Well, basically a similar picture emerged. Here we saw that greater emotion regulation difficulties was linked to increases in PTSD over time, increases in depression over time, and also increases in social stresses. So, relationship difficulties, conflict, those kinds of issues over time as well. Again, we also found economic stresses to be a really impactful factor in exacerbating mental illness and social stress as well over time. So again, the key finding here is the same, but also expanded a little to really show how emotion dysregulation and economic stress both seem to be functioning as key drivers of subsequent PTSD, depression, and social stress. So when we come back to this idea of, does emotion dysregulation cause mental illness among refugees? Well, longitudinally, that certainly seems to be the picture that's emerging. And it suggests to us that providing strategies to help people to better regulate their emotions may be a really helpful pathway to improve mental health, alongside, of course, policy and environmental and structural interventions to address those economic stresses we saw and those post-migration stresses we saw in the Australian sample as well. So this obviously begs the question, which emotion regulation strategies are actually helpful in promoting recovery? And so when we talk about emotion regulation strategies, I mean, really there's hundreds of them, right? It's any kind of cognitive or behavioral thing that you do to influence your experience and expression of emotions. So that covers a lot. But what we know in the research is that there are a couple of really key strategies that have been looked at that are quite pivotal to mental health. The first one is this idea of cognitive reappraisal. This is where we simply change the way we think about a situation in order to reduce the emotional intensity. And this is, this image is a good picture of, both people being stuck in the rain, but having perhaps slightly different appraisals of it. And a lot of the research with non-refugee cohorts has shown that the use of this strategy is quite adaptive and associated with better mental health. On the flip side, another very widely used strategy that I'm sure all of us use at times as well is emotional suppression. This is where we actively attempt to reduce or eliminate or hide our emotions and our emotional expressions and thoughts. And this is generally been found to be quite unhelpful. It's associated with worse mental health outcomes in non-refugee groups. But at the time of me starting my PhD, really not a lot of research had looked at, what about refugee communities? What kinds of strategies are people using and how might they relate to mental health? And so one of my studies did that, which was looking at people's strategy use across both of these strategies and seeing if there were distinct profiles that emerged and seeing whether these different profiles or repertoires of strategy use uniquely related to PTSD and emotion dysregulation. So one of the best ways that we can do that is using an analysis called latent profile analysis or latent class analysis, which basically just looks at how people answer questions or people's pattern of behavior across multiple items, and then it groups people who show similar patterns so that we can actually sort people into groups based on similar behavior, in this case similar strategy use. So in this kind of study, you measure people's reappraisal and suppression use, how much they're using these kinds of strategies in their day-to-day life in response to stress. And then you run this analysis to see whether distinct profiles emerge. And then you can see if these profiles relate to other things, like their mental health, for example. So we did this with a group of refugees and asylum seekers, just under 100 people living in Australia, predominantly from Iran. This is what we found. And so I'll just walk you through this because it is a little, it looks a little complicated at first. Now, on the left-hand side, these are all of the items that were measuring people's use of suppression in their day-to-day life. And on the right-hand side of the dotted line are the items that were measuring reappraisal use in day-to-day life. And so if we look at this red line along the top, this group, which represented a bit over half of the sample, we called the high regulators. These are people who are using a lot of suppression in their day-to-day life, but also they're using a lot of reappraisal as well. Now, the blue line we called adaptive regulators, about a quarter of the sample. These were people who used a lot less suppression, but still quite a lot of reappraisal in their life. So predominantly reappraisal users. And then about a fifth of the sample we called maladaptive regulators. This is the green line, and this shows people who use really high levels of suppression throughout their life, but virtually no reappraisal at all. And so then we wanted to understand, okay, well, look, there are different profiles. Not everyone uses emotion regulation strategies in the same way. Does this then impact their well-being? And what we found is that those adaptive regulators, the people who predominantly used reappraisal, they had the lowest rates of PTSD and the lowest rates of emotion dysregulation. Whereas the maladaptive regulators, the people who are using using suppression really highly all the time and virtually not using any other strategy, they had the highest rates of PTSD and emotion dysregulation. And then our high regulators, that red line, who use a lot of both, they were in the middle. So this suggests that reappraisal use, either by itself or alongside other strategies, is linked to better psychological functioning. So when we come back to this question of what strategies might be helpful, it's generally telling us that learning and using engagement-focused strategies, which is how we think of reappraisal, because it allows us to stay engaged in the world but change the way we're reacting to it. These tend to be a much more helpful way to improve one's mental health rather than avoidance-focused strategies, things like suppression, where we actually make our world smaller by avoiding people or conversations or things that make us stress, and we push away or bottle up our emotions, which, as we all know, will often mean it will come back to us in curly situations when we're least expecting it. So these kinds of findings taken together have some important clinical implications. Specifically, it's suggesting that maybe if we target emotion dysregulation, this may actually be an effective way to address psychological symptoms, but also some of this kind of social relationship stress as well. And so 2 of our current projects have really been looking into this in a really large scale treatment focused way. The first is something which is basically a clinical trial that we're running in Indonesia at the moment with 300 Afghan and Iranian refugees. And they're receiving a 5-week scalable mental health intervention, and a small number are also receiving a waitlist control so that we have something to compare that to. And this intervention was developed by the World Health Organization. It's called Doing What Matters in Times of Stress. You can see the workbook on the screen now. It involves getting a workbook that's translated. There's cartoons, it's not too word heavy. And it comes with audio files. And in our particular version of delivering it, we worked, I was lucky enough to kind of train and work with a cohort of refugees from the community in how to actually deliver this intervention to their peers. So, giving participants a call once every week for 5 weeks to go through each of the 5 lessons, each of the 5 strategies, and practice using those strategies and make plans on how you're going to use that in your day-to-day life. So because in Indonesia there's no mental health infrastructure and there's no resources, it's not helpful for clinical psychologists in Australia to fly in, deliver an intervention and then disappear. So this was really focused on building capacity within the community to also deliver this kind of emotion-focused coping program. Now, in terms of the strategies themselves, they're just hiding on the tablecloth on the title page of the workbook, but it really has an ACT-based background, so acceptance and commitment therapy techniques that are a real antidote to emotional suppression, right? It's basically doing the opposite. Rather than pushing away and avoiding your emotions, you're learning to change your relationship with them, to make space for them, to unhook from them, learning some emotional grounding, and also some self-compassion work, as well as some work on how to act in line with your values. Now, this trial is underway. We're actually finishing our last participants as we speak. So I don't have the formal findings, but the anecdotal report so far from participants and the refugee staff delivering it has been really positive. So we're excited to see what might come of this. But we've also been testing a much higher intensity version of emotion regulation skills training in Australia. And this is through another randomized control trial with a much smaller cohort of refugees with PTSD. And this is a trial that is, much more kind of your traditional trial where there's a group of clinical psychologists, including myself, who delivered this treatment to people with PTSD that we, formally diagnosed with PTSD. And this involved 13 weekly sessions, where the first 6 sessions were focused all on building emotion regulation skills. And then the last 7 sessions, the second half, was actually exposure therapy. We used narrative exposure therapy to really treat and target those PTSD symptoms. So this trial, the results are still ongoing as well. But what I want to focus on is what emotion regulation skills training looks like with refugee clients. So this manual that you can see here, this was developed by Marilyn Cloitra and colleagues in the US. And this is called Skills Training in Affect and Interpersonal Regulation. And it's all emotion regulation focused skills training. And this was developed for a very particular context, specifically for military personnel and also for survivors of child sexual assault. That these researchers and clinicians noticed alongside their PTSD and depression also had a lot of emotion dysregulation problems, and wanted to see whether targeting that before going into your traditional trauma-focused exposure therapy led to improvements, which they absolutely found. So this was one of the best manuals available at the time. But as a team, we knew that we needed to culturally adapt this to make sure that the content was really applicable and helpful and relevant for refugee clients who have very different experiences to military folk, for example, as well as, just US citizens. So we underwent quite an extensive process of cultural adaptation, which involved consultations with the original creators of this treatment, as well as consultations with community, using our own research. And we developed and piloted something alongside the interpreters who work in our team, who are intercultural therapy assistants, many of whom have refugee backgrounds themselves. And I want to highlight some of the elements here, because I think what you'll see is that the same rules apply in terms of what emotion regulation skills training looks like. We're just slightly adapting the way we deliver it, or the content, so that it's really relevant to the people that we are working with. So our refugee adapted version of this STAIR manual includes, like almost every treatment, a lot of psychoeducation, helping people understand what the relationship is between how past traumatic experiences and current stress might actually be linked to that feeling like your cup is constantly overflowing with negative emotions right now. And one of the best techniques for delivering psychoeducation, particularly cross-culturally, and this is backed by a lot of evidence, is using case studies. So in our program, each lesson participants would start going through with the therapist, listening to the story of Salim and learning about who's a fellow refugee, and learning about his symptoms and his difficulties and the steps that he took throughout this treatment program to make changes in his life and learn new strategies. This can be really helpful, particularly among communities where we know mental health stigma might be really high. This can help to reduce that stigma through normalization, and also through modeling the process of actually seeking help and engaging with therapy, which can be quite new for some people. It also is a really gentle way to start to approach conversations that then often lead into the client then feeling comfortable talking about, well, ways in which their experiences might be similar or different, or their symptoms might be similar or different to Salim's. Another aspect of this culturally adapted treatment involved using a lot of metaphors to deliver psychoeducation. And as someone who has done all of my clinical work almost exclusively with the help of interpreters, I know how important it is to make sure that we're conveying concepts in a clear way. And I find that very few things outperform metaphors. They're just really great ways to aid understanding. And so we talk about emotions and emotion regulation a lot in terms of it being like an ocean, where different weather conditions can affect the state of the ocean, just like our emotions. And we can learn to harness our emotions, just like we can learn to harness the power and beauty of the ocean. But also, if we don't have strategies and we don't understand what we're experiencing, we might feel like we're drowning as well. So this is kind of a great way to convey these kinds of concepts, rather than doing what I'm doing right now, which is kind of lecturing at you, right? It's about developing a story together that makes sense. And finally, there's also a lot of focus on building emotional awareness. We do this in this particular program using a feelings wheel to try and kind of foster acceptance of all emotions, understanding that all of our emotions, even the negative ones, have a purpose, and are often telling us something important. And this is trying to be an antidote to this idea of suppression, where the temptation is to push away those, quote unquote, bad emotions. We also use really basic CBT principles. We talk about how emotions are comprised of 3 channels. When we experience a strong emotion, it affects our body, causes certain body sensations. It affects our thoughts. We have particular kinds of thoughts, and it also impacts our actions and behaviors. And so the main crux of the intervention is really, over most of the sessions, is actually building people's tools for living, which is what it's called in this program, which is really just developing individualized strategies that target each of these channels. So, when we feel really angry or sad or frightened, that affects our body sensations. What are some strategies that we can use to nourish our body? We tend to focus on the themes of things like sleep, diet, exercise, and pain, as these tend to be quite core problems for at least the clients that we've worked with. We also have a session focusing on thoughts. We know that when we have intense negative emotions, they can often come with really intense thoughts. And so as an antidote to that, what are some coping statements that we can use to strengthen the mind? And again, this is really just reappraisal. What are some different ways we can think about the situation to help us feel a bit better? And then finally, to address our actions, because we know when we're really frightened or sad or angry, we might do or say things that are not quite in line with our values. We might isolate ourselves more or get into an argument with others, which of course makes everything worse. So what are some individualized positive activities that can be helpful in those moments to make things a bit better rather than a bit worse? So that's just a bit of a taster in terms of what it looks like in our particular program. But as you can see, these are quite universal techniques that are just being delivered in a format that is relevant to this client population. Again, we're in the process of analysing these findings, but I can tell you that they are looking quite promising. So hopefully there'll be some exciting updates on that soon as well. But basically, in summary, I think the key points here in terms of what the research is telling us is firstly that people from refugee backgrounds might be especially likely to have higher rates of mental illness, as well as emotion regulation difficulties. And that these emotion regulation difficulties, alongside other things, particularly environmental stress, can really exacerbate mental illness. And so improving someone's capacity to manage their emotions can be a really helpful way to improve both their psychological but potentially also social well-being, which is really important for folk that are adapting to a new life in a new country. So these might be some of the factors that can be helpful to consider when working with people from refugee backgrounds. Just to close, I really want to acknowledge the enormous team who supported me and led many aspects of this research that I've spoken about today, including our research partners in Australia and the Asia Pacific, but above all the members of Australia's and Indonesia's refugee communities who so generously take part in research, which is not always the most fun thing to do, in order to help us build an evidence base that can be used to actually improve policies and services and treatments. So really, really thankful to them. And also thankful to you for joining the last talk of the week. If you do have questions that aren't addressed in our Q&A session that we're jumping into now, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. But otherwise, thank you so much for your interest and for coming along.
Thank you so much, Dr. Specker. That was great. I really found that so just so insightful into emotion regulation and sharing the good work that you're doing through RTRP, both here in Australia and overseas. Just to give you, I guess, a chance to take a breath or water before I ask you to talk through some more questions. I was just thinking, you know, like emotion regulation doesn't happen alone. It's shaped by culture, family, and community. And I think through your session, it's got me thinking about how you would explore emotion regulation, how it supports that resilience. I think even flipping that stat around, you know, it's 2 in 3 that are, you know, there's that resilience and trying to explore that, as well as considering how community and that wider context does impact the safety that's needed for healing. So I guess when we're talking about us as mental health professionals, we can honour these emotional survival strategies and support freedom, not just through treatment, but through culturally attuned and community-rooted care, you know, building, like you mentioned, building that capacity within the community. And I guess it's almost using just basically different language around these, what you said, universal techniques, and creating them tools for living. So coming back, I guess, to that theme of finding freedom, diversity, and community, it reminds us that freedom is both external and internal, felt in how we manage our emotions and connect with others. For refugees, it might be about regulating overwhelming feelings after trauma as part of rebuilding lives. So we have about 10 minutes to answer questions raised through registration. So I'm going to get you to speak up again, Dr. Specker. So now I've just lost all the questions. Okay, so this was kind of like posed as a statement, and it might be just you adding any further comments on this, but around that necessity of, because I think you've kind of answered this in the presentation, is the necessity of emotional regulation in refugee populations and ways to communicate this with I guess refugee populations, I think is what they're trying to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone has their bias. I think that emotion regulation is really relevant. I think it's relevant for everyone, but especially relevant for folk who've experienced really intense trauma and ongoing kind of protracted, complicated stresses. Because what we know is that these kinds of experiences bring up so many negative emotions. There's fear, there's anger, there's a sense of injustice, sometimes there's guilt and shame, sometimes there's a lot of sadness and grief and loss. And so unlike, you know, perhaps some of their peers who maybe haven't had these kinds of experiences, refugee clients might be walking through the world with such an enormous burden of intense emotions to constantly regulate, and that gets exhausting. So the way that that at least I've found helpful in kind of expressing that to people who maybe have never really thought about their symptoms in terms of this very kind of Western CBT idea of emotion regulation. We talk about it in terms of it's like walking through life with a big bucket. And when you experience a lot of trauma and stress, you know, this means that your bucket is filled really high with lots and lots of water, lots of negative emotions. And so what might happen is when you come to Australia and, you know, you're adapting to a new life and you see other people and, you know, both of you miss the bus, but for some reason your bucket is overflowing and theirs isn't. It's probably because you're carrying all this extra stuff that you might not be able to see and you've been carrying for so long you probably don't even notice. But what we can do when we focus on this, particularly in therapy, is we can learn some strategies to be on how to manage those moments when the bucket overflows. But we can also do some work together, and I'm referring now to kind of trauma-focused therapy, where we also try and drain that bucket so that it's not as high, so that moving on in life, you can have your past experiences, but not necessarily carry them into your day-to-day interactions if you don't want to.
Yeah, great, thanks. Because I was going to say that use where you spoke about in your presentation around metaphors does really resonate, and I think it does make sense to do that. So I guess that kind of another kind of related question was just, you know, how would you explain then the concepts of, would it be similarly done? You've had a picture up there around cognitive reappraisal. You had a photo, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think this is one of those ones, and I'm also open to suggestions from others as well, because I'm sure lots of people grapple with trying to make these things make sense to anyone, because they can be a bit abstract. But essentially, one of the biggest challenges I've noticed for clients from refugee backgrounds that I've worked with is a lot of the stresses and difficulties that they're dealing with are huge and not always solvable or immediately solvable. So obviously, if you're in a situation where you fall over and hurt yourself, it's not helpful to go, can I think about this in a different way so I can feel a bit better? No, the most helpful thing is actually to address your needs, solve the problem. But when you are constantly faced with very big unsolvable problems, or at least not immediately solvable problems, like being separated from the rest of your family, like having a lot of uncertainty about your visa, these kinds of situations, it can be really helpful to recognize that whilst we cannot control all aspects of the problem, we do have power and influence and control over how we react to those situations. And so it's about bringing some of that control back into that experience and understanding that there are things I can do in this moment that can make this painful, but not adding any extra suffering to it. And there are also things I can do in this moment that will make it worse. And so it's about bringing that control back into the individual in terms of their reaction and relationship to emotions in the context of life stress.
Yeah, and that can make it really very empowering for the person when they feel that they are out of control of other things in their life.
And also realistic, because we're not saying that the goal here is to just think positive thoughts or think, you know, these things are unfair and it is awful and it's absolutely valid to feel like there's a lot of injustice in your life. And so we don't want to negate that, but we also don't want it to become something that's so overwhelming that there's no space to have meaningful life experiences alongside that frustration.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And so another question that's come up is around how is, or maybe we'll ask it this way, how do relationships with family and community members influence emotion regulation among refugees? And they've asked particularly youth, and what role might these networks play in interventions?
It's a really, really great question. It's also a big question as
Yes.
well. It's really interesting. We've only done a little bit of research on age-related differences in emotion regulation. Specifically, we actually find that emotion dysregulation or emotion regulation problems are especially problematic the older you get in terms of influencing mental health. And that's, I think, probably because when you're a child and adolescent, emotion dysregulation is pretty normal. For every population. So it's kind of less of a sense, it's less sensitive as a predictor of influencing things. But if those things don't resolve and we don't build skills to manage that, that kind of then becomes much more strongly and clearly a problem for folk later in life. But I think what came through overwhelmingly in the clinical work that we've done for our research is how much, when we talk about emotion regulation, we are talking about collectivist conceptualizations of this. And so something that we do in our treatment programs is we often start with creating goals. You know, what's your goal? Why do you want to do this? It's helpful for maintaining motivation because, you know, going to therapy can really suck after a while, especially if it's bringing up negative emotions. But what we consistently find is that people's motivations and goals always relate to, or very often relate to, family and community. So I want to be emotionally stronger so that I can better support my children. Or I want to be able to manage my emotions because I don't like that I have fights with my son or my wife, for example. So I think that being able to focus on the ways in which emotion dysregulation might influence and negatively impact people's relationships becomes a really powerful motivator in terms of why I, as an individual, might go to therapy or go to get resources and help for something because it actually affects my network. So we've found that to be a really strong motivation for people. But in terms of harnessing the rest of the network in the pursuit of, you know, improving one's well-being, I think a lot of the time when we came up with individualized strategies, they were always focused on how to bring other people in. They always had like quite a pro-social vibe to them. And that's because sometimes, you know, positive activities, it might be nice to actually, you know, read a book with my son. And that's a way that I can help calm my body in moments when I feel frightened. Rather than isolating myself, I can actually use this as an opportunity for connection. So sometimes that can be really beautiful. I also want to acknowledge, though, that it can also be really challenging when we're talking about communities that have collectively experienced trauma, that there might be multiple people in the household that are experiencing lots of different kinds of symptoms, and some people's experiences might lead them to have more expressive emotions, and others it might lead them to isolate more. And so sometimes these interactions can be really challenging to unpack on an individual level, and that's where family system approaches or community capacity building approaches are really complementary to, you know, individual treatment approaches. They're definitely not one better than the other. I think all of these things have a really important place and work in complementary ways.
Yeah, no, that's really great to hear. Coming as a clin psych as well, it's kind of nice to hear the idea of, you know, I guess CBT, which it can be quite, have that Western lens, to then be able to include family, community as part of it. Although it's not so easy, as you said, it can be quite complicated. So I guess just to finish off with, you know, you did mention where you were going with your research. What's sort of the next steps? Is there anything specific around?
Yeah, I think really we're really excited to unpack the findings that we have from these much more clinical trials, so that we can really learn, firstly, does this kind of approach lead to not just immediate improvements, but sustained improvements over time for people? And then also questions, starting to ask some more fine-grained questions like, are there particular sessions or components that are especially helpful? or who benefits most from what kind of intervention as well, because we know that this might not be the perfect fit for everyone. Some people might really benefit from these kinds of approaches, but some people might need other types of interventions too. So I think what we're seeing in our research, but also across the field of mental health research, not just refugee specific research, is a move towards this idea of precision or personalized treatments. So starting to think more about, rather than a one size fits all, thinking about what are the factors I need to understand about this individual and how can I make good choices around what intervention to pair with them so that they can get the best outcomes.
Great, that sounds so good. It's very exciting to hear. That looks like there's some great new sort of exciting steps with the research.
Yes, hopefully in a future Transforum we'll have all the exciting updates there.
Excellent. So I'm going to take that as you were going to be coming again. I don't have to invite you. Anyway, it's now it's past 1 p.m. So thank you so much, Dr. Specker, for sharing your research, and look forward to you then presenting again sometime in the future. So that concludes the questions. But before we get on with our day, I just wanted to get our evaluation up and where you might want to learn more. So a reminder that if you are wanting to learn more, head to our Refugee Mental Health Program webpage by scanning the QR code or via the link on screen. And please get in touch if you've got any issues that have come up or questions following today's webinar. As mentioned, we will be sharing the recording on our website of all the webinars in case you were unable to attend or wanted to revisit them. We also value feedback. So please scan the QR code and also let us know if there are any topics for ideas for future webinars in this space. Thank you again so much for being generous with your time, Dr. Specker. Thank you all for coming along today and throughout the week and being part of TMHC's Transforum research series. Today and through this week, we hope by listening to evidence, hearing the lived experiences collectively, we're able to hold both in order to do our everyday work as mental health professionals to provide culturally responsive, trauma-informed and person-centered care. Happy Refugee Day for everyone tomorrow, and wishing you a good day ahead.